welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King. I'm the editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal, and the Debrief here is CJ's weekly wrap-up of everything that we've seen happening here in state politics, state policy, all the stories that we've been covering for you. Make sure you subscribe. We're going to be bringing this to you each and every week to supplement what we're covering there on carolinajournal.com. You can read more about everything we're talking about right there on our website, so don't miss it. So joining us this week on the couch is, of course, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation. So glad to talk to you this week. And Alex Baltzegar is our political reporter covering the North Carolina General Assembly for us. And a new face to the Debrief, certainly somebody that we all know and love, Dallas Woodhouse is from the American Majority. He's going to be weighing in, bringing his knowledge, institutional knowledge of what's been happening in Raleigh. And David Larson, Carolina Journal's opinion editor, always excited to hear what you have to say in your outrageous story of the week. That's a big one. We're going to come to that in just a minute. Let's start off with the North Carolina Senate this week. Couple of big pieces coming out of the Senate. They kicked off the week presenting their version of the state budget, kind of wrapping it up, passing it. Bipartisan majority approving the North Carolina Senate's version of the state budget, now going for the next steps. But the bigger news coming out of the General Assembly this week, the override of Governor Roy Cooper's veto of SB 20 put some guardrails there on abortions in North Carolina in the first and second trimester. That was a heated debate all week. Here's a little bit of what bill sponsors Vicki Sawyer of Iredell County, Amy Galey of Alamance. Here's what they said on the Senate floor.
Quite frankly, their smear campaign is a veiled attempt to not help women, but to pad their political coffers through promoting and perpetuating a fear campaign. You see, their true anger is not about this bill's guardrails on second and third trimester abortions, which is supported by most North Carolinians. Their anger is that this bill is mainstream and a common sense approach to a very difficult topic. This is compromise legislation, a sentiment that has been shared with me by Republicans, independent voters, and whispered to me by moderate Democrats.
The Democratic Party is bought and paid for by the abortion industry. Within moments of the press conference when we announced the conference report for Senate Bill 20, Governor Cooper and Attorney General Stein emailed fundraising blasts begging for money. You can bet that in the months to come, the Democrats will exaggerate and lie about this bill in a desperate attempt to capture dollars. Look at the campaign finance reports filed by Planned Parenthood PAC-NC.
Yeah, so, Alex, you were there. You saw this. It was a really heated discussion. Lots of visitors there in the North Carolina Senate. It's made some national news. What's the mood going on down there now at the North Carolina General Assembly?
So I think there's somewhat of a sense of relief that this is over with, because it was, as you could see there, it was a very impassioned debate. And over the course of the 2 weeks where they were debating and talking about this, at least once we had a bill to look at, there was a lot of passion. You saw it from the senators, you saw it in the House, you saw it from the protesters. Right. So there's a lot of heated discussion. That's definitely one of the more controversial topics that the legislature has been tackling this session. Sure.
So the argument from bill sponsors and supporters has said, look, we're still most permissive in the region. Was that their key argument, and what were Democrats focused on?
So yeah, I think Vicki Sawyer, who's from Iredell County, she had a point that this is a very moderate bill.
Okay.
And this is about the most moderate thing that the Republicans were considering in the first place. They were looking at doing potentially a 6-week heartbeat type of ban, or the 12-week, which is very much right in the middle of the mainstream. And they landed on the 12-week ban, except it's not completely a ban because there are exceptions for rape, incest, life of the mother, all the way through pregnancy, fetal abnormalities. So there's a lot of exceptions. It sort of puts us on par with countries like Europe, which we typically think of as more liberal. And so I do think she had a point about this being more mainstream and moderate, but obviously that's not what the Democrats said. They said this was a complete ban.
Sure.
I'm just going to say that it was a very impassioned debate. I thought it was a good debate. I thought the Democrats, made their point. Of course, in my personal opinion, they exaggerated the impact of this bill, but they certainly had their chance to have their say. The activists on both sides had their say. And that's the way it's supposed to be. That was really what conservatives have wanted for 5 decades, was to be able to have this debate and let it be decided on the floor of a state legislature. And that's what we saw. And I think the Republicans deserve a lot of credit for being able to do this. I mean, I have spent some time recently in South Carolina where they have struggled, even though they have a much more Republican legislature, to come up with a policy. You know, the Speaker of the House, and we're going to talk more about this later, did a masterful job in keeping the votes together and finding consensus. And what you're going to see is that Democrats are really not going to run against this bill, which allows abortion to 12 weeks and then limits it afterwards. They are going to run on that this is going to get worse, that Republicans want to get rid of all abortions, even though there's not really any indication that that's the case, because if that was the case, they would have done so here. So it was a good debate. Republicans were masterful at the legislative process, and we go forward from here.
Sure, sure. So, David Larson, we've been talking about this a lot in CarolinaJournal.com. One of the arguments is that North Carolina remains one of the most permissive places for it, but this may be a fundraising opportunity for Democrats, I would imagine.
Yeah, as Dallas was saying, that's a lot of it. Is just, you know, even if it's not the most extreme, they're using words like ban without saying 12-week ban, or extremist and not extreme compared to what? Are you comparing it to the other states around? That's the question that Cooper got at one of his recent media appearances. I think he was on CNN.
Sure.
They're like, well, actually looking at the other states, you know, this 12 weeks is fairly moderate, and as Alex said, some countries in Europe, generally this is about where they have it. Polling shows it's about the same.
Okay.
So yeah, that is sort of, I guess, the landscape there is seeing it as calling it extreme, maybe for for that reason.
But let's just remember, if you're on the Democrat side, which they have put out that there should be no limits to abortion up until the day that a baby is born. If that is your position, this is extreme.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, remember, one of the reasons that this has been an issue in which Republicans basically had to negotiate among themselves is that they know the Democrats wouldn't allow any of their members to support the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Bill, which was basically, if a baby is born after a botched abortion, a doctor has to ensure that he or she offers protection for that baby's life.
Sure.
The Democrats wouldn't allow any of their members to vote for that. And if they did, like former State Senator Don Davis, now a member of Congress, he would get pilloried and be described as a disloyal Dem for saying that, oh, a baby survives a botched abortion, let's not protect it.
Right.
That was the point. And the other thing to me that's interesting is Democrats often talk about Roe v. Wade and how sacrosanct that is. Roe v. Wade, the 1973 decision, basically said nothing to stop an abortion in the first trimester, and then you could start having restrictions after the first trimester. Well, guess what? 12 weeks is about the first trimester. Right. We're going back to basically what was in the Roe standard. It was the later case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that said you couldn't have any restrictions until viability.
So this is most consistent with Roe v. Wade?
It's very consistent with Roe v. Wade, which originally just said, okay, you can't do anything, you get no limitations in the first trimester, but then there were increasing limitations in the second trimester, and you could basically do whatever you wanted in the third trimester. This legislation is fairly consistent with that.
It's very consistent with what Roe v. Wade actually said, but not with what a lot of people believe Roe v. Wade said. Which a lot of people believe Roe v. Wade said abortion should be legal at any time, and people don't like that. So look, the bottom line is what we saw here is something that was different. I mean, the governor, you know, once Republicans announced this deal, they had come up with it. It was going to pass.
Sure.
There was no doubt in my mind. The governor picked on 3 or 4 legislators like they were going to change their mind. That was never going to happen. This was well worked out and well choreographed by Republicans. But to me, it shows you the money and the investment that the abortion industry has in the Democrats. Because why would they put themselves out there? Why would the governor make himself look so weak when he knew he was inevitably going to lose this? That is because they are beholden to this.
Well, that's the point.
this horrible industry
Right.
that makes money off human death.
Sure. So yeah, we did a little research project over here at Carolina Journal and have kind of the breakdown of how much Planned Parenthood of North Carolina has spent in North Carolina elections over the last 4 cycles. We're talking about, approaching actually $10 million. There was more than $1 million spent in the month before the 2020 elections too. So you're right, this is a huge industry. By comparison, the National Rifle Association spent about 1/10 of that. So Planned Parenthood PAC is really influential in North Carolina politics, and Roy Cooper, I think, really knows that. He sent out a blast text. We heard Amy Gailey talk about that on the floor there, saying a blast text went out within minutes of this vote. This is the blast text that came out within a few minutes, and it's signed RC. It went out to fundraisers going, okay, look, we need your help. We gotta push them back. We're gonna stay and fight. And it had a link to donate to the party. So it seems like that is where this is headed.
And if you're going to have all that kind of money coming in from Planned Parenthood, it shows that having new restrictions that are common sense, that are in line with what the majority of people want, is bad for their bottom line. Their bottom line is only going to succeed if there are no restrictions, because
Sure.
they want a lot of expectant mothers to come in and get abortions. That's
Right.
how they make their money. They do other things, as they are frequently want to say, but the way they make their money is people coming in and getting
Sure,
abortions. It's
sure.
not through their family planning service.
Shifting gears just a little bit, Alex, we had some breaking news actually today that the Senate budget looks like it got some bipartisan approval. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so the Senate budget just passed the Senate chamber with bipartisan support. There were 7 Democrats who voted in favor of the budget, which was not all that surprising. I was honestly a little bit surprised to see 13 out of the 20 Democrats vote against the budget.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff that obviously Democrats wouldn't like in there, but passing a budget is tied to implementing Medicaid expansion.
Right.
And that's something they've been pushing for years, so I did think that was interesting. But the budget's going to put us around $30 billion again over the next 2 fiscal years.
Sure.
There's some good stuff in there.
What happens now?
So the Senate has passed their version, which
Okay.
was different from the House version. And so the House will now get a chance to concur
Okay.
or not concur with the Senate version. They will vote not to concur.
Okay.
And then both chambers will go to conference and talk about it and negotiate things and sort
Very
out their
interesting.
differences.
And inevitably, the House will hold out
Sure.
for some higher teacher raises. They will hold out for some higher state worker raises. And this will take a few weeks, and they'll get a budget done. I think at the end of the day, there will be a number of things put in the final budget that Democrats do not like. The expansion of school choice will be funded in the
Right.
budget. There are other things that will be in the budget they don't like, but one of their key priorities for years has been, the expansion of Medicaid, which the John Locke Foundation, of course, has been on record opposing for over a decade. The question at the end of the day here about the budget is not whether it's going to be passed, not whether it's going to become law, is it how many Democrats will swallow things they don't like that Republicans want to do so they can say they voted for Medicaid expansion. And what does the governor do? Does the governor allow it to become law without his signature, or does he sign it so he can
Sure.
finally have some kind of legacy being expanding Medicaid?
Well, that brings us to another topic we really wanted to kind of talk about. Has this been a decade in the making? You had a tweet this week recognizing Speaker Moore and his leadership over the last, 10 years or so. Have they, we've talked about how much has happened in the last 2 weeks. Has it been coming for a decade?
Well, what I look back at is over the last year. As you remember, the House Speaker wanted to run in a newly drawn congressional district, taking in his home of Cleveland County, part of Mecklenburg. That got thrown into a blender and all chopped up when Congressman Madison Cawthorn decided he was going to come over and challenge the Speaker because he thought he was going to be able to pick his replacement in the far west and move in a different district, and because he was going to go against the Speaker because the Speaker was a go-along to get along Republican. Look at that now. Look at how this looks a little over a year later. Madison Cawthorn is out of Congress, defeated in a primary. Madison Cawthorn is a convicted criminal because he just had to plead guilty to a gun charge, bringing a gun through an airport. And what has the Speaker done? The Speaker stayed in the legislature for another term. He has done a monumental job, and he almost elected a supermajority, got one member on the Democrat side to change parties, and has had two major override votes, one on a gun bill, one on an abortion bill, where he kept all Republicans together. And on most votes, he has been able to get some Democrats to cross the line with him. It has been a mastery of the legislative process. And at the end of the day, Republicans were not very happy with, and I'm sure the Speaker wasn't happy because he wanted to go to Congress. How lucky Republicans are that it all worked out the way it did, and that they had House Speaker Tim Moore in there to lead them in this session, which is going to go down as one of the most successful Republican legislative sessions in the history of the state of North Carolina.
And we probably shouldn't be surprised that he has been so successful, given that he is the record-setting longest speaker in North Carolina history.
As Berger is too, right?
Well, he is not he is the longest-serving leader of a legislative chamber in the United States, but not the longest-serving in North Carolina ever, because Mark Bass Knight served in that job for 18 years. Berger's in his 13th year. But on the House side, Moore is the longest-serving House Speaker. The previous record was held by a guy, Liston Ramsey, who got booted by his own party in a strange deal with Republicans. And then Jim Black, who went to prison. So Tim Moore has served longer than they have, and knock on wood for him, not going to have any problems that they have.
And the reason I point out Tim is that, look, he had to negotiate. You know, when you have a large caucus like he does, now 72 members, he has members of the Freedom Caucus, people like Keith Kidwell, who are far to the right, great guy, but he would tell you he's one of the most conservative. And now he's got a Tricia Cotham, who until recently was a Democrat. He had to put a bill together on abortion that every one of them would vote on. And he was able to do so. That takes a mastery and an ability, and that's why I knew when a deal was announced, it was going to pass. And I just think that he deserves tremendous credit. I mean, we have long known that Senator Berger has been a legislative master. He has been, the second most powerful person in North Carolina for a long time. But I think I think you have seen Tim Moore really establish his legacy in the last few years.
Interesting. So, David Larson, you and I have been covering the legislature for a long time, for different outlets, actually. What are your thoughts about this? Has it been 10 years in the making? They've been focused on keeping taxes low. Some of these issues have come up, particularly in opportunity scholarships and school choice.
Yeah, I think Dallas said it all right there. That this is an opportunity. Moore is taking big advantage of. He's got the votes, and there are some different opinions, but he's been able to maintain relationships and be strategic. And get a lot of the stuff that he wants to get done. And yes, Tricia Cotham coming along has made that easier, but his outreach to, taking some advantage of the chaos in the Democratic caucus to see some of these people aren't that happy, maybe we can form some relationships there. And even to the extent of bringing one over, but there's still a lot of other relationships that are ongoing, even if they're going to stay in the Democrat caucus. And that's helped them a lot to make, a decade in the making come to happen in a session. How
big a role do you think Cooper being term limited has had on this?
I guess, pretty big, and he's seen as, I guess, a lame duck at this point. So yeah, I think, he's taking some advantage of having that override power now. Too.
I wrote recently on that the Democrats only had one strategy, then that was to block and oppose and to have Cooper veto, and they really weren't engaged in the legislative process. And when they were no longer able to block everything with a veto and able to prevent overrides, they didn't come into this session with much of a plan, and I think you've seen that.
Sure, I got to throw this in while we're talking about it. Newly minted Republican Tricia Cotham put up a tweet last week recognizing your birthday.
And that's some nasty
right? Mean. So she said, "Happy birthday to Dallas," and I love the response, which makes me laugh. I mean, who would have thought that they would be melting down over a birthday wish from Tricia Cotham to Dallas Woodhouse?
Yeah, I've known Tricia for a long time. We were friends when she was a Democrat. We were friends when she was a Republican. I think there's been a lot of. I think there's been a lot made of Tricia Cotham's change that is not reality. I mean, I think that Speaker Moore was going to get these bills done anyway. He has shown an ability to do it. He has had Democrats on his side. You're not going to see him pass these overrides and other things with a big margin because he just finds the exact number of votes he needs. And the Democrats have needed a whipping boy. They've needed something to point at and go, look at all our problems. If Tricia hadn't left us, as David will point out in a second, if there weren't this terrible gerrymandering issue, we would be able to do stuff.
Right.
When the fact is they've become very ineffective. They have not come up with good plans, and they have isolated themselves by their positions from too many voters in the state.
Sure. No,
And Moore has taken advantage of that by being willing to work with Democrats. And this is not something that just materialized this session. Over the last session, basically said, let's have a budget where we can get 5, 10 Democrats to go along with this, so there's no chance that Roy Cooper will have a veto.
Sure.
And that is, I think, something that he's wanted to put forward in more ways than one.
Right.
I think this also. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no,
I just think this kind of shows some of the mood, especially online among the left. They like to have, like you said, a whooping boy, or whether it's Trump or somebody. They just get really worked up. Kind of reminds me of in 1984 they had the 2-minute hate, where they gather everybody around and have some person that they direct all their ire at, but she's become kind of their figure, and it kind of unites them, but it's also a weakness because, it brings if you demonize the other side to that extent, even somebody who's almost with you, some moderate, then you're not going to be able to really contribute. They're not really contributing to any of these deals the Republicans might be willing to make because they're just demonizing them.
I'd love to see a column from you on that. Good analogy. We mentioned briefly the opportunity scholarships. Tell me what's the latest on that. We had some movement on that this week.
Yeah, so the House yesterday, Wednesday, passed out their version of the Opportunity Scholarship. It's actually identical to the Senate's version, so I probably shouldn't call it their version. But the legislature together has agreed on a bill for Opportunity Scholarships.
Okay.
And what it does is, that's just another word for the way we're packaging our school choice legislation. It would give a voucher to students. And at least in the Senate, I've heard this term a lot. They call it backpack funding. And so the money follows the child rather than the money just going to the institution, so the government school that's nearest by, and then they assume the kids come. This will go straight to the students so that they have more choice to go to a private school, charter school, homeschool. They have a lot more options now.
Interesting. So could that be for anybody, any parent? Doesn't matter about income level?
So income level is a factor. It's sort of a progressive scale, and so if you make more money, if your household makes more money, you're going to get less back in the taxpayer dollars.
Now, Donna, this is really something that developed over the decade. Republicans started at this by creating a scholarship fund for just children that had special needs. And it was very hard for the Democrats to be against that. Then they were able to create a small program for children of very low income. Then they grew that over time. Now, given that they have the votes on their side, this was the opportunity to offer school choice to all families in North Carolina. Now, the Democrats hate this. The teachers union hate this. But mark my words here, it's on tape. They'll never be able to roll it back. Because you can't take things away from people. And once parents, most people are still going to go to a high-quality public school in their neighborhood in North Carolina. But there are going to be a lot of families that choose to go to private parochial schools that were not able to do so before. Or homeschool, but they will not be able to take this away in future years. So the Democrats can demonize it, but they're going, the question that needs to be thrown to Democrats in the future is, okay, now what are you going to do?
Right.
One thing I found was kind of almost despicable about the media, not the media, but people that are against school choice. They're portraying vouchers and this kind of thing as, a tactic of segregation. They'll point to, an example long ago, but I mean, you look at public schools, you could say that much more so, where you had
It's
segregation
literal
in public schools
yeah.
for many decades. So I think they're trying to distract from that a lot of people will like this, and the minority communities included, and trying to scare some people away from it, saying that maybe there's ulterior motives underneath. For white parents that want to flee certain schools and things like that.
They're trying to find a reason for people to be against it. Because if you look at it on its surface, you go, oh, this makes complete sense. But if you say, oh, but this is something that was part of the racist past, then that might steer
It
people.
actually had bipartisan support in the House too, but
That's
only by
encouraging.
one member, and that was Shelley Willingham, who's
Okay.
a Democrat from Edgecombe County.
Right, and he's been clear about it too.
African-American.
Now, so shifting gears just a little bit, one of North Carolina's associate Supreme Court justices made a big announcement today.
Yeah, that's right. Michael Morgan, whose seat is the only seat on the state Supreme Court that's up for re-election next year in 2024, has said that he is not going to run for re-election. He is in the tail end of his single 8-year term on the court because of mandatory retirement rules. Had he run for re-election for another 8-year term, he basically would have only been able to serve about 3 years. So it's not terribly surprising that he would decide not to run again. But by announcing this officially, he now opens the door for whatever Democrat wants to run, or Democrats. Probably based on previous history, there will be one Democrat who will emerge as the candidate and move forward.
As a matter of fact, it is fairly likely that I would predict by the end of this summer and no later than, say, March of next year, that Morgan will likely retire from the court. They will probably elevate Allison Riggs, who was recently appointed to the appeals court, into the Supreme Court for the final year of his term and let her run as an incumbent. That is typically how, if you control the governor's office, which can do appointments to the court, that is typically how things work. It won't necessarily work that way here, but I would personally be very surprised if Morgan finished out his final day in January of 2025. I would expect that he will exit the court before then.
Very interesting.
But a couple of other interesting things to note, that we know that even before Morgan made any announcement, there was already another candidate in this race, as initially reported by Dallas back in November of 2022. Appeals Court Judge Jefferson Griffin, shortly after the November election, said, hey, I'm going to run for that Supreme Court seat in 2020.
And I would just point out that Mitch makes a good point about the mandatory retirement age. However, both the House and the Senate budgets have provisions in there that would raise the age of the mandatory retirement, so he could have served through most of a final term if he won. However, he is in his mid-70s and he may want to retire, but he would also
Well, he isn't now, but he would be.
But he would be. That's right, he would be. But he also knows that the Republicans are going to control the North Carolina State Supreme Court to at least 2028.
That would impact Paul Newby, the Chief Justice.
Well,
correct,
right. They would be raising the age for Paul Newby, but the bottom line is, even if the age was raised, that would also affect Mr. Morgan. He would still be in a numerical minority. He would be in a Democrat minority for the rest of his time. And that is clearly not a very fun way to be for them right now. Mr. Morgan and Anita Earls liked it in the majority a lot more, and I think that undoubtedly that has a role in his retirement.
Yeah, just a few short years ago, Democrats had a 6-1 majority. They're now in a 5-2 minority with just Morgan and Earls. Just to put a cap on that mandatory retirement age, it's 72 now. The budget bills would raise them to 76, which could have affected Morgan, but also would definitely affect Chief Justice Paul Newby, who under current law cannot serve his full term. He would have to retire by the end of May 2027, which would mean about 19 months of his term to be filled by the next governor, whoever that is. If this change in the mandatory retirement age passes, he can serve out his full term through the end of 2020.
And by the way, I think Republicans need to think hard about this. You know, I certainly would like to see Newby be able to finish out his time, but you know, when I see the current president we have, who doesn't seem to know his own name sometimes, I'm not so good that I don't know that I'm in love with the idea of raising the retirement age to 76.
So David Larson, all of this inside baseball, this is the part I love, of course, but the outside, the political theater, you know, that's something you've been focused on a lot, particularly as Governor Cooper went around to all the national media talking about what's happening here in his backyard, but maybe not calling the members themselves to work it out. He went straight to MSNBC and CNN.
Yeah, I think he knew that, you know, with the Republicans passing this, that they had the votes, and calling each of those members and really trying to bring them around probably would be not effective. So instead, he went on to a few media outlets. He went on CNN and CBS and some others, and showed, his frustration with his veto no longer having the power that it once had.
Sure.
By directing the blame instead to gerrymandering.
Right. We actually have a clip of that.
Yeah.
If you want to
So
watch.
here's some of what he said about that.
Yeah.
If you take a quick glance at your legislature and your Supreme Court, one would have the impression that North Carolina is a very deep red state, and gerrymandering is one of the things that your state is dealing with. This is an undermining of the democratic process. Most people in your state probably support what you were saying yesterday morning as you vetoed that bill, and yet you have to overcome a Republican supermajority in the legislature.
Technologically diabolical gerrymandering, some of the worst in the country. And in fact,
if you take
Catchy. It's catchy, right?
Yes, he in one of his appearances called it super gerrymandering, and another one called it technologically diabolical gerrymandering. So having kids and also just remembering having to hear that
Supercalifragilistic.
that Mary Poppins song, kind of super technological diabolical gerrymandering. It's like he's trying to
expialidocious.
He's trying to make it out to be that's the big problem is the gerrymandering.
Right.
But you look at the legislature. The House passed their chambers districting bill 115-5. So it wasn't gerrymandered according to the Democrats at that time. And the Democrat Supreme Court also took a look at it and said, that looks fine, signed off on that. And then the Senate, state Senate map, using that map, 59% of the vote was for Republicans, and they need 60% to get a supermajority. So they're pretty close in to having that, although the Democrats didn't run people in all the counties. I think the bigger problem that the Democrats are seeing more is that the Stevenson decision, which we have a couple legal experts here on the courts that can chime in on that, but back in 2002 brought back the whole county provision.
Okay.
And that, it really limits how crazy
It kept the Democrats from gerrymandering as bad as they could to try to hold seats.
But the problem for the Democrats is going to be a lot of their population is condensed in cities.
Right.
And because they're not spread out very well, the Republicans would almost have to try to make a 50-50 map. And with the whole counties, most maps are going to slightly favor Republicans.
Right.
So.
Democrats can keep fussing about this till the cows come home. The fact is they have a geographic problem where their voters are concentrated in cities. But at the same time, there are vast areas, and Mitch and I remember it, the district that covers Davidson County that Hugh Holliman, a Democrat, used to have is basically unchanged. The Democrats no longer compete in areas they used to compete in. They either change their issue set and they change their political coalition to try to go win these places, or they just keep going on MSNBC and making excuses, but they will never govern in a legislative
Mitch,
sense.
we have a couple of big cases that you've been following about this too.
Yeah, in fact, some of the things that are going to be cropping up in the coming days are what happens with the new redistricting maps. I mean, obviously, the state Supreme Court has come back and said, you know what we said last year about redistricting? It was all wrong.
Right.
We shouldn't be involved in any of this anymore, which means the General Assembly pretty much has free reign as long as they don't racially gerrymander to draw the districts the way they want. And they're going to get districts that will elect a majority of Republicans who will continue to run the General Assembly. With Roy Cooper, we haven't mentioned it yet, but he's basically sort of trying out for his next job, whatever that's going to be.
Yeah.
Is he going to run for some national office? Is he going to run for Tillis's Senate seat next time around? He's trying to get some national publicity. But as Dallas has alluded to earlier, I don't know that you necessarily want to spend a lot of time talking about how you failed. With a national TV audience, which is kind of what he's doing.
Sure. Alex, what's the next step on maps and what we've been talking about at the General Assembly?
So the legislature's plan is to finish up getting legislation through, and they're planning to adjourn at the end of June.
Okay.
And then they will come back later for the redistricting. So we don't know how soon that'll be. That may be July, it may be August, it may be a little bit later.
Okay.
I assume they'll give legislators a little bit of a break after this extremely busy session. But that'll be the plan.
All right,
They'll come
we'll be
back and draw
following that.
maps later.
And they can't wait too long because filing for these new seats will start at the end of the year, beginning of the new year. So they have to get it done
I tend to
probably
think
by the fall.
maybe July.
All right, well, we're going to be following all of these stories really, really closely. I hate we're running out of time. We could do this for a while. So those are a lot of the stories that we've been following on Carolina Journal. Please subscribe, follow us. We're going to be sending this to you every single week, this wrap up with good analysis. Thanks so much for watching, and tune in next week with more from the Debrief. Bye.